killing Hitler has never felt so satisfyingly non-linear as it has in Metroidvania Works 17.
Don't yell at me, it doesn't help! Okay, which is the button to turn it on?
Last episode, we saw The Guardian Legend, a game that combined top-down, non-linear exploration with vehicle-based, action-style dungeons. Now, Sunsoft's Blaster Master flips the scripts by bringing us non-linear vehicular exploration with top-down, action-style dungeons. That is to say, The Guardian Legend treated vehicular sequences as a destination, with the on-foot bits there as a hub to build your heroine's power as you traveled from one shooter showdown to another. In Blaster Master, the vehicular sequences function as the core game, moving you amongst the on-foot combat sequences you need to master in order to complete that game. It's a subtle distinction, I suppose, but a noteworthy one, because it means that the lively, active shooter portions of Blaster Master comprise the meat of the game, which is good. But it also means that the on-foot sequences feel more like a chore than they did in The Guardian Legend. I think this comes down to the fact that, unlike Miria's powers in The Guardian Legend, the abilities you gain for your metal attacker combat tank in Blaster Master don't carry across modes. When you step out of your tank as the tiny Jason, your pedestrian arsenal consists of a gun and a grenade. That's a marked difference from The Guardian Legend, which allowed Miria to use all of her sub-weapons and power-ups and skill enhancements universally in both exploratory and combat modes. It doesn't help that Blaster Master attempts to incorporate a variable power system for Jason's gun reminiscent of Miria's. But again, these work differently. Where the power of Miria's main weapon was determined by her supply of energy chips, a total whose cap progressively increases over the course of the game, Jason's firepower comes down to the icons he finds along the way. When Jason takes damage on foot, his gun downgrades in power, shedding an icon, and meaning that the more damage you take from enemies, the more enfeebled you become. This gives players a lot less control than Miria had over her weapon output, which lay entirely in players' hands. The more chips they spent on secondary weapons in The Guardian Legend, the weaker her main attack output. It also means that Blaster Master's alternate gameplay modes aren't as interesting or effectively integrated into the core Metroidvania loop as The Guardian Legends. And that's a damn shame because the tank-based portions of Blaster Master rank among the absolute best non-linear exploratory action to be found on an 8-bit system. In fact, Blaster Master introduces quite a few mechanics and concepts that would become fundamental pillars of the Metroidvania format. All of the permanent skills you earn by killing bosses manifest as tank upgrades, turning a vehicle that begins the game as a highly impressive energy-spewing mech with the ability to spring into the air into something even more incredible. Granted, not all of the power-ups you collect here are especially inventive. One of them is a literal key used in a single door, and two others give your tank cannon a power boost that also functions as a key, by allowing you to break open doors to, say, the second stage. But then you have things like the ability to climb walls, to dive into water, and even to fly. These boosts increase the range and potential of your tank, allowing you to reach new areas and explore more of the world. Blaster Master appears to be structured as a linear game, with each of its 8 zones existing as standalone spaces. And once you unlock more of the metal attacker's potential, however, you begin to realize that the plutonium boss's underground lair is crisscrossed with pathways and connections that allow you not only to backtrack, but to take convenient shortcuts once you've fitted the tank with the proper power-ups. The first stage acts as a hub of sorts, a space that you return to time and again. Heck, you open the second half of the adventure by returning to the actual starting point of the game and using your hover power to fly up into the open sky right above where the action begins. Blaster Master is the first game we've seen that really and truly drops enticing hints of future transversal throughout the adventure, giving you glimpses of spaces that draw the eye while making it clear that you can't visit those places just yet. But once you acquire new powers, you can't help but think back. Oh, I saw something that was blocked off before. Where was that? In this sense, you could almost forgive Blaster Master's failure to include any sort of password or save feature. Heck, the US version limits you to 5 continues before forcing you to restart the long, difficult adventure from zero. I find it difficult to believe that anyone could have hoped to complete this game on their first go, but I do think it's realistic to think that first-time players could hope to complete a few stages and gain a couple of upgrades and expand their abilities. Newcomers might collect, say, the second cannon upgrade from Stage 3 before finding themselves feeling hopelessly lost and running out of continues. But the next time they play, they're bound to spot some of the blocks that the maxed out tank gun can shatter in some of the earlier spaces of the game. At which point they mark those spots with a mental note to return once they've beat the third boss again. And hey, there are even some barriers throughout stages 2 and 3 that the enhanced tank would be able to break through, meaning it'll take a lot less time to backtrack than it took to reach that boss in the first place. And what's the deal with that spike-lined wall in the first stage that's too narrow for the tank to traverse and too high for Jason to jump on foot? It seems to lead somewhere, but you're left wondering how you can possibly pass through it, at least until you gain the ability for the metal attacker to climb walls, and drive right past those spikes anyway. Blaster Master is certainly a flawed, uneven, frequently unfair game, but it looked and sounded great, and the tank sequences offered buoyant excitement thanks to the limber yet responsive control scheme. And those strengths were more than enough to keep players hooked, despite the lopsided difficulty and over-reliance on boring on-foot combat as load-bearing game spaces. Those who took the time to pay attention to Blaster Master's interlocking layers and workings got a first-hand glimpse of the Metroidvania genre's blueprints being drawn. Our second game this episode doesn't fit quite as neatly into the Metroidvania box as Blaster Master does, due to its self-contained level structure. But the spirit of the genre, and the spirit of fighting fascism, live on in Capcom's Bionic Commando, a game for the ages. Bionic Commando began life as an arcade game with a fairly simple structure. Players had to fight their way through a handful of levels using their wits, their weapons, and a bionic grappling arm that allowed them to zip quickly upward and swing across gaps. The bionic arm introduced an element of vertical space management to the platform genre, which made the action feel looser and more open than anything that had come before. I mean, here we were just a couple of years out from Pac-Land and Super Mario Bros., games that basically said, hey world, here's how scrolling run and jump platformers work. Bionic Commando had the temerity to get rid of the jumping while introducing an enormous degree of freedom to the scrolling. Its stages didn't consist of simple point-to-point reels, but allowed its hero to move in all directions, finding their way to the goal at the end of large, intricate spaces. Capcom would build on this concept in arcades with Black Tiger, introducing more complex interlocking spaces to the mix along with an economy, and some prototypical RPG leveling mechanics. For the game's sequel on NES, Capcom's home design team took a similar tack. Bionic Commando on NES bears about as much relationship to the arcade game as Section Z on NES did to its own source material, which is to say not a heck of a lot. The home version of Bionic Commando spans about a dozen primary action stages, rather than 4, and while these levels still scroll in multiple directions, they have a much greater sense of focus, purpose, and structure. However, while the game assigns sequential numbers to its levels, 1 through 12, you not only don't play through them in this order, you can move freely between them. On top of that, it also adds another half dozen or so additional stages that exist entirely for the sake of storytelling, navigational hints, and providing gear and equipment. All told, Bionic Commando features a huge number of stages that span a simple map, and players can travel between them more or less at will. These hard divisions between stages disqualify Bionic Commando as a proper Metroidvania experience, since you duck back out to the world map to move between one level and the next. But the spirit of the action RPG is strong here. For starters, Bionic Commando features a simplistic leveling system akin to that of Castlevania 2. You can collect bullet tokens from defeated enemies, and these act as stand-ins for cumulative experience points. At certain milestones, protagonist Captain Ladd gains additional health in the form of an extra pip on his life meter at the top of the screen. By default, at the game's start, you have no health pips at all, making Bionic Commando for NES appear to be a straightforward action game like the original at first glance. But by the time you reach the first communications room, where you confront the need to interact with NPCs in order to achieve certain game objectives and open critical paths, you'll probably have collected just enough icons to have added a single health point to your endurance, allowing you to withstand 2 hits before you die, twice as many as in the coin-op. But more crucially, you collect equipment by defeating bosses and interacting with certain NPCs. These fall into 3 categories: weapons, tools, and communicators. In order to progress the game, you need to acquire items in all 3 categories. Guns obviously expand your repertoire of combat abilities, but they also function as keys, with each extra weapon offering the ability to break a certain barrier somewhere in enemy territory. Likewise, you need the full suite of communicators in order to interface with the encrypted comm system throughout enemy bases. You can't access a level's boss chamber until you've spoken with one of your allies via that stage's comms room. It's all fairly rudimentary by modern game design standards, but for 1988, it was a pretty groundbreaking approach to adapting an arcade conversion, standing right alongside Tecmo's take on Rygar, though with greater refinement. With its basic RPG elements, a sprawling storyline that involves rescuing the original game's hero while bloodily exploding Hitler's skull, and some great interlocking quest progression structures, Bionic Commando exists slightly outside the platonic lineage of the Metroidvania format, but it still remains an influential work all the same. Next time on Metroidvania Works, the Metroidvania genre fights the law as it rocks the Casbah, or something.